Now, staying with that story, Beijing has urged direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine during a call between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and American counterpart Antony Blinken yesterday. This comes as today reports also suggest that the second attempt to evacuate civilians from Mariupol has been halted as pro-Russian separatists and Ukrainian official trade accusations. Now, the call by China is quite significant, especially because the country has been cautious in its approach to this particular issue. Let's look at the story further with Professor David Monyae, an associate professor in political science and international relations. He's also the director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, thank you so much for your time this evening. Let's talk about the significance of China's call for direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, especially because we've seen that this country has been taking a cautious approach thus far.
China plays a critical role. It is not only the second largest economy in the world, it also has good diplomatic and economic relation with both Moscow as well as Ukraine. So it plays that bridge building process, especially at this time, where views are so different, particularly the Western world and Russia. And therefore, I think you always have to open a bridge. The idea of putting Russia and President Putin on a corner and not giving room for him to negotiate is quite dangerous. And therefore, I think it's a great move that Beijing could reach to these parties. And it's not only Beijing. If we look much more deeper, we see other countries such as Israel, quite close to the United States, yet it abstained, considering its own immediate interest and reaching out to President Putin. The Prime Minister has been to Moscow and spoken to President Putin. And equally, South Africa, we are in more or less similar situation. India, these are countries that are opening way, trying to bring peace in a way in terms of opening a room for both Ukraine and Russia to speak to each other.
Some, Prof, though, have described the move by Israel to get involved as both bold but at the same time risky. Where are you leaning towards?
I think it's a calculated move. Let's look at it. Countries do not just take any position, such as the one taken by Pretoria to abstain. Similarly, Israel, when it looks in its immediate neighborhood, Russia plays a very critical role, particularly in Syria. And therefore, I think if you look at the role that Russia is playing on the African continent with endless coups, Pretoria has to also put that into consideration that Russia is an important power in the world politics, particularly in the security sector. And therefore, opening that room and by abstaining, it does not mean that both Israel and Pretoria condone what Russia is doing in Ukraine. It's just a calculative national interest and nothing else, a pragmatic move that put into force its own domestic as well as regional and global interests.
Now, one of the things, that some are saying, especially as we're watching reports coming from around the world, is that the impact can also be felt on the ties between Russia and India as well. And some reports even suggest that some Indian businesses may seize this particular opportunity and use it as a moment to expand their presence in Russia. Could we see this happen?
Yeah, indeed. But when it comes to India, the relationship between India and Russia is quite deep. Since 1970s crisis between India and Pakistan, it was the then Soviet Union, particularly 1971, 1972, that vetoed most of the UN Security Council vetoes led by Western world. And therefore, even though at the moment India moves alongside United States and UK in terms of dealing with the rise of China. But when it comes to this particular crisis, India finds itself on the side of Russia as well as China, but in walking a very tight rope in the sense that this is an issue-based and very calculative and also opening ways in terms of its own interests. Its military depends on Russia the entire Indian military and weaponry buys from Russia. And one should not be naive to expect India to really move alongside Washington and UK on this particular matter.
And Prof, what sense are you getting when it comes to South Africa's decision to abstain? I mean, we saw this, of course, coming out even in the UN and really taking that partisan stance. I wonder, in your view, what could be the implications of this from South Africa's perspective looking on into the world?
There are a number of factors. I think there are three major factors. Let's look firstly domestically. President Ramaphosa is about to go to his party's electoral conference, and as it stands, ANC is much more, groups within ANC that is much more leaning towards the left, and it is pro-Russia. And I don't think he can afford taking much more radical view with the perception that he might be leaning towards the US side. So at the party level, when you look at the economy of South Africa, I think it's have investments from all over the country, the world, China, Russia, United States, and European Union. And therefore, taking that view from a domestic perspective, it's a wise move. At a regional level, it's a question of the role that both major powers, Western world, as well as Russia is playing. And therefore, South Africa calculatively has to ensure that it balances those interests and ensure that it can reach to both parties, not just in Ukraine, but also on matters on the African continent. At a global level, lastly, I think it has also to do with the ongoing deglobalization. When we talk about deglobalization, is that there's a lot of move, particularly in the Western world, where they're now looking more insular and not playing really a proactive role in dealing with global conflict, particularly in developing world, Africa especially. And therefore, I think for South Africa, it is to ensure that multilateralism are strengthened and ensure that peace and security wherever in the world, with the rise of hotspots all over the world, the issue of trade protectionism, it's on the rise. And therefore, at this moment in time, it's good to play human rights issue, but one has to look at some of these really troubling factors that forces any government to take and to abstain, particularly on this particular matter.
As a final question, very briefly, Prof, as we talk about some of these efforts in order to try and build a bridge somewhat for these two countries to possibly even lead to a permanent ceasefire, do you think things have gone far enough and we may not see a permanent ceasefire anytime soon? Or could we see, a dramatic change in what we saw in the last 10 days?
The situation is moving quite fast, and anything could happen. And as we know, we look back, we are all concerned about a sudden situation moving from Ukraine, affecting other countries. As it stands, the United States is about to get more air power from Poland, for instance. And chances are high that accidental events could lead us to a much more Third World War. In absence of a Third World War, we are now entering a much longer Cold War, post-Ukraine crisis. This is a changing world order, and we have to read the situation, understanding what's happening in that area, plus understand the global economy. We are going to suffer, particularly in the emerging markets, in terms of high oil prices and other factors, the spillover from Ukraine crisis.
All right, Prof, thank you so much for those insights. That was Professor David Monyae, an Associate Professor in Political Science and International Relations. He's also the Director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg.